Welcome to episode number 13 with enterprise security expert Javvad Malik.
Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show.
Hey, if we had this in place, then we wouldn't have got breached. Oh, we did have this in place and we still got breached.
Welcome back, everybody. This is your host, Bill Murphy, with the Red Zone podcast. Today, the title is very compelling, I know. The title of this particular podcast is Enterprise Security Shelfware Meant to be Bought but Not Used? And which security technologies are gathering dust on the shelf and why? So I reached out to Javvad Malik. Javvad Malik was a senior analyst at 451 Enterprise, which is a research consultancy organization, until about a month ago. I had originally heard him at a security conference speak on this topic we are going to be discussing. He now works for AlienVault as a security advocate, and prior to 451 consultancy, he worked as a independent security consultant, and he also worked with NatWest Group, Royal Bank of Scotland, Halifax Treasury Services, Lloyd's Banking Group, amongst others. He's an active blogger and event speaker and is one of the most prolific industry bloggers, video bloggers, I might add, on YouTube for security. So he has a very lighthearted, fresh approach to security that I think you will appreciate. So we get into the very, very specifics of why enterprise security software is not ending up fully deployed or it's partially deployed. And you're going to learn which technologies fall into that category. And also in the show notes, I'm going to have links to this presentation that I had seen at RSA, where you can get into more details on the technologies and his perspectives on it. Also links to his books that he's written and other interesting tidbits about him. So with that, I'd like you to take out pencil and paper and get ready for the show. If you enjoy this program at the end, please go to iTunes, where this show is posted on iTunes, and leave me your comments. We're also on SoundCloud and Stitcher. Stitcher if you have a Droid phone, and SoundCloud if you prefer to listen to the show through your web browser on your Mac or PC. So either way, please leave me your feedback. It's wonderful if you can do that. So with that, let's jump right into the show. Okay, Javvad, welcome to the show today.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Well, I like to say that probably my most favorite slide from last year's RSA conference was enterprise software was not built to be used, it was built to be bought. And I thought that was one of the funniest slides I've heard. And you had just a wonderful presentation that it's called Security Shelfware, Which Products Are Gathering Dust in the Shed and Why? So why are security products not being used, and why are they ending up in the shed, do you think?
So I think that's $1 million question, isn't it? And so to understand that, I think I started before that, and there's this whole sort of like dissatisfaction with kind of like there's so much security vaporware out there, it doesn't really do its job, or it over-promises, under-delivers, and this whole set of like, hey, if we had this in place, then we wouldn't have got breached. Oh, we did have this in place and we still got breached. So it's kind of like a genesis of these mixture of ideas and concepts. And I was really trying to get to the bottom of it. Like, are the products really at fault? Are they really that bad that people are just selling them just because they want to make a quick buck, or like snake oil, and move on? Or is there something really fundamentally flawed in the way that they're procured or how enterprises use them? So that's really what the whole genesis for this was. And getting onto that, I was speaking to many CISOs and sort of like CIOs who I've worked with in the past, and the number of products that they said they bought and then it's just been shelved, or some of them never even made them out of the boxes, actually was staggering. So that's kind of like what brought me onto this whole path of trying to uncover why exactly do products, particularly security products, just end up on the shelf.
So let's get into that a little bit more deeply. But before we do, I want to find out from you, how did you get involved in the security profession? Right? You've had a very interesting career working for several major organizations over in the UK. You have your own consulting organization, a blog, very awesome, by the way, video blog. You've worked for 451 Research, and now you're with AlienVault. So tell me about how you got started. Like, what was the superhero story that got all this started?
I wish I had a superhero story. It's a lot more simpler than that. I done a degree at a university, and there was a 1-year optional work placement in that. So I went around applying for every kind of job I could. I was just happy to get anything. And this one bank had a vacancy for an IT security operations team member. And I thought, that sounds interesting. I had no idea what IT security was, very little. And I joined the bank. And to be honest, not even the broader IT team had any idea what we'd done. They would know us as the guys they would come and have a nice word to if they wanted their password reset and they didn't want to go through the help desk. Those were my startings, basically. And once I figured out what it was, I got pretty addicted to it, and I stuck in the industry ever since.
Well, you seem to have a very serious message, but you have a lighthearted way of delivering it. Why do you have that approach?
Isn't that the British way? You deliver things in a very dry, self-deprecating manner, and
like a Monty Python way, right?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. People deliver how they like to receive. So, I mean, I find an engaging or interesting or sort of light-hearted approach far more easier to absorb myself. So that's how I try to distribute the information as well.
Well, I think it works. And last year when you were in the presentation, you had talked about what are the technologies that are actually ending up on the shelf. And can you talk a bit about the top leaders? So the top leaders and why they are the top shelfware security products.
Yeah, sure. So the leader by a clear margin was SIM. The next big sort of like one out there was IDS. And then you had WAF and IPS. And I suppose the why it's a multifaceted answer. But in essence, what differentiates all these products, these are all pretty much, they're monitoring, but you actively have to do something with the information they provide. They're not products that it's like a traditional antivirus, say, for example. And I'm not here to debate the effectiveness of antivirus, but the fact is that the way you use it is you install it and then you pretty much forget about it. It might throw up an alert saying, hey, I found something suspicious here and I've quarantined it. But that's about it. With a SIM, particularly, for example, you actually need to work out what you're going to use it for before you actually even deploy it. So many times we've heard of people saying that, we bought a SIM because of everyone else was doing it, so it's keeping up with the Joneses, or we had compliance requirements to procure one. So we bought a SIM, we plugged it in, and then we were like, okay, what does it do? What are we meant to do with it? So it's that fact that, not having those clear use cases, are similar with IDS or IPS as well. If it's throwing an alert your way, it's giving you some information and you need to tune it continuously. You need to figure out, what's true and what's false in it and actually take some action. And that's the hard part for organizations. I mean, they go through this whole pain in installing these products and then it's like, oh, now we have to do some more with it. I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for those pesky kids. So these products just keep on going. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons. The other reasons are like, hey, we only bought it because of compliance. Compliance said buy it, so we bought these WAFs and they're sitting there propping some doors open. Our PCI auditor comes along and we just tell him, yes, we've got WAFs, and he ticks the box and walks away, and so on.
Is your belief that compliance is going to stop just approaching this from a checkbox and they're actually going to start asking meaningful questions that are going to prove whether or not there's the products are being used?
I think it's a scale issue. You're not really going to get the quality of auditor at the scale that you need. There are some very good and competent sort of auditors or QSAs out there who can come and really help a business. But when you look at the majority of, there's so many enterprises that need it and the skills just aren't there. So there are some auditors that don't really understand the technologies very well. They're from a non-technical background. So, you could show them any dashboard and say, this is this, and they'll believe you. Or they'll be overly prescriptive. And so it becomes like this kind of like dance between an auditor and an enterprise. It's like, who can pull the wool over whose eyes best. And that kind of like defeats then the whole object of the requirements.
I had not heard that before. I think that is an interesting way of saying it. You said scaling. The issue is scaling auditors. But that is it's an amazing way of putting it. But you're absolutely right. There's a huge gap between skills between auditors. So essentially, it becomes a who can sell who when having conversations instead of getting to the real use of these products.
Yeah.
So I see SIM as a big leader here. What's the problem? Why do people partially install these? I know you mentioned compliance. Is it also potentially a skills gap?
So skills gap is another thing. So, in order to make sense of the alerts that come out of a lot of these products, you need someone who can understand what it is and then who can articulate, normally to a non-security expert, why it's important that certain actions are taken. And it's not necessarily sometimes a technical skills gap. Maybe it's that communications gap that we often hear thrown about. So whether that be communicating that risk horizontally or even up the chain to a senior stakeholder, that is also a challenge. One of the other sort of like really interesting trends that came out and was that a lot of people were like, hey, our CISO just doesn't hang around long enough to see an implementation go through, or the CIO who the CISO reports to, or one of the senior stakeholders, they might be on a 3 to 5 year average stay, and then they'll move on to the next enterprise. And the problem is that when a successor comes in, they'll normally scrap half of what the predecessor put in place or want to stamp their own authority on it. That's another reason. And then there's also a big kind of disconnect we found between what a vendor would consider reasonable and what an enterprise considers reasonable in the amount of resources you need to run a product. So as an example, you might take a security product and a vendor might think it's perfectly reasonable that you need 3 full-time staff to manage this certain product. Whereas from an enterprise perspective, they might be looking at a product and looking at how much they're paying for the product. And they think, hey, we should be able to do this with 1 or half a person. And that really creates a big bone of contention between the enterprise and the vendor. And then, people don't talk to each other. And then you try and do your best you can with half the recommended resource. And then, that person gives up and moves on.
Well, I would say that the vendor probably I noticed from listening to various vendors, they want to hedge that number down. Because almost if they say that you need a huge support staff to maintain this, just picking on SIM, for example, because they're pulling events and logs from various devices, that wouldn't they want to say as low as possible, the support of their product?
They want to do that, and they try to do that. The actual theory and the practicalities of implementation vary greatly. And particularly in large organizations, the challenges they have is large organizations aren't large by accident. They're kind of like Frankenstein IT developments, which have been morphed together through legacy systems, new systems, mergers, acquisitions, split-offs. So even if you buy a SIM, you have to do a ton of configuration to, get it to pull in feeds from your legacy systems. Then you're like worried about if you've acquired a business and they're using a different SIM, and then you're trying to correlate it all together into one product, or you're sending your logs over, or you have a very distributed environment where you have a number of remote offices. It just adds to the complexity. So the need to put in these Band-Aids over all of your holes to make it work pushes up that resource requirement significantly.
Well, I leave the RSA conference, and most of the vendors that are speaking and the companies that are speaking that are not vendors are large enterprises, and they're having a very, very difficult time finding advanced persistent threats. They're finding it really difficult finding threats that don't want to be found in the organization, and they're failing. The large companies are failing. We're not talking about the small, medium. We're talking about the large. So as a researcher, as an expert in this area, what is going to shift that from absolutely getting killed to winning?
So I think one of the big things that these large enterprises, that their biggest challenge is their size and complexity. Forget about finding an APT. They can't even accurately predict, in the majority of cases, what all of their assets are, what they look like, how many users do they actually have. And I've worked in enterprises like this. Like, you go into an enterprise and you say, okay, we're doing an identity and access management review. Okay, fine. How many users do you have? Well, we've got 20,000 in head office, but then, and they're all on the HR system, but then contractors aren't on the HR system, and those third parties aren't on the HR system. And, and you have like 5-6 different systems that you have to try and like merge just to figure out how many real users you actually have. And that's users. And that's something that, you think it should be pretty easy to figure out because you're paying them. And from the infrastructure point of view, figuring out where all your assets are, that's really like what patch level are they at? What version are you running of software? If you can't figure this out, then figuring out where the advanced threats are, or where some malicious nation state is trying to infiltrate you, it's kind of like good luck with that.
So you're saying that complexity is upstream, much less finding something really difficult. They're having a hard time managing the easy stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really where the challenge is. And I think if you start at that level, manage out and start with the crown jewels, if you know where your crown jewels are and what they are, and then spread around your controls everywhere. Because even if you think you're really good at threat modeling, people have their biases and you're always going to have some blind spots somewhere. So it's best to start sprinkling around beyond your core assets, start sprinkling around controls and start hardening your security that way.
Would you say it's an even split between the capabilities of the product and your people and your processes, or is it even across all of that? Or would you say that you would sway the importance towards one of the three or two of the three that I just mentioned?
It depends on the nature of the business. And that's the consultant in me coming out again. Yeah, everything just depends, and give me a 6-month contract and I'll work it out for you. But I think the technology is probably like the lowest rung for me. I think it starts with the people, and then you go on to the processes. So people are really the important side. That's something I've kind of like focused on a lot. And, I remember when I started out and we were doing IT security in the bank, we didn't have fancy systems. And I now sound like a really old man. Get off my lawn. We didn't have none of this. So our privileged password management system consisted of us writing passwords on Post-it notes, putting them into a small envelope, signing each of the corners of the envelope, and then putting sellotape around all of them, and then putting that in a binder. And that was our privilege management system. So if anyone needed to use a password, they'd have to tear the envelope, and that would be tamper evident, a poor man's tamper evident envelope. And, they could then log on, and then you would check the access. So I'd say you can get a lot of security done without technology. You can get a lot of security done with open source technology as well, or very in-house built things. What you can't do security without is the people who are willing to partake in that, and what you can't do is without the processes needed to support that. And that can be like process in people's minds. It doesn't need to be absolutely written down somewhere and set in stone, but there needs to be a process.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially when the complexity is. There's a theory. There was a great new book out by an FBI futurist, and he said he recommends that we should have a militia, a cyber militia, because it's so far beyond, in the U.S. at least, of the FBI's capabilities, local law enforcement. And it's almost like within an organization, we need a militia as well that rises up to help with training, education, awareness building. It seems we can scale that type of knowledge quicker than you can scale fancy systems. Yeah,
I agree. I think that's a really good point. I'll have to look that book up.
I'll send you a link to it afterwards. One of the questions I have is about cloud security, especially from the SIEM and the log management. And is there an opportunity for companies that don't want to scale their security departments with people, looking for the needle in the haystack? or are getting overwhelmed with the complexity, and it's not their business to be managing. It's their business to govern, but their business is not IT security. Is there an opportunity for cloud providers, do you think, to step in and fill that void effectively?
So do you mean like MSSPs kind of like thing that, or just pure cloud technology?
I'm using probably the wrong word. You're absolutely right. I'm thinking of SaaS vendors, MSSP vendors. Yes, that's what I'm really referring to. So services delivered from a cloud environment, but yes, MSSP, SaaS providers, they can actually, you could outsource those capabilities. Do you see that as a viable alternative for businesses?
Yeah, now it's a strange one because when I was at 451, which was just last week, so I think I can still say that I quote some of the stats there with relative confidence. We saw a few years ago a number of companies outsourcing their SOC, Security Operations Center, to a managed service provider from the cloud. What we have found in the last year is some of the functions have been taken back in-house, and they've left some of the basic ones. So like something like an IDS is preferred to be outsourced, but the actual SIM, sort of monitoring or the actual core SOC functionality, companies, we've seen sort of like a slowing trend. And so some of that has been down to the service provider not understanding the environment well enough, or maybe there's been a breakdown in the communication when an enterprise makes a change to their environment and the service provider hasn't been made aware. So they either then start saying, hey, there's something really dodgy going on in your network, or they miss it altogether and you have large chunks of your environment not being monitored. So I think we'll probably see more of a trend to go back that way once some companies can work out how to manage that whole process properly. But there definitely is like a lot of value that can be gained from that approach, especially for like smaller security teams that, like you said, that don't have that desire or the budget to increase their headcount. So, a lot of tasks can be managed outside. But, there is a lot of effort still needed in making that work successfully from both parties. So it's not like a magic, like, hey, we'll just throw all of our logs that way and we can wash our hands off it. It really depends on how well that relationship's managed.
I totally agree with you. I think that you're absolutely right that there's an opportunity for a company to outsource appropriate tasks to a vendor who's got that skill set. But it's garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good control of your data and have a good understanding of your own systems and processes, to outsource that and make that someone else's problem is going to be a rough go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know, so during the presentation, it was interesting balance. It was between vendors' issues that causes products to sit on the shelf, and then user-created problems that cause products to be half installed, overlapping functionality. So you kind of spread the blame between companies creating their own problems and vendors contributing to that as well. Do you still feel like it's an even responsibility between vendors causing this problem in users, or do you think it's swayed one way or the other?
Summary in one of my main conclusions was that, yes, there definitely are some vendors who are guilty of, say, like, and it's possibly not the vendors as a company themselves. It's generally some salesperson trying to close their quarter out strong, where they'll overpromise some functions and features and then underdeliver. I mean, other companies we heard of that was just systemic, where they would take your money and then customer support was really, really difficult. But by and large, the main problems that that came out were really on the buyer side. And a lot of it came down to not understanding what the use case was for the product, buying it blindly because of a compliance need, or some internal political issues came up. Your CEO played golf with someone and he then said, you have to buy this, and you had no say in the matter. Or just like the CISO moving on. But the majority of kind of like reasons really, unfortunately, pointed towards the enterprise. And one of the challenges is it's a long process. So particularly like a SIM, it's the average buying cycle that we found is something like 12 months. From like, hey, we need a SIM, let's start shortlisting them, all the way through to, okay, we've decided on this. let's get it, let's install it, let's configure it. And in a year, like for a lot of companies, a lot of things can change. So it's, having that future vision and strategy is really important when buying anything.
Well, I love also that you had some recovery tips for people that have purchased a system that they're not getting full use out of, or they don't feel it's properly deployed. So I think you had some good tips for a CIO or a security officer. And it looks like there was basically three types of recovery tips. What do you think is the most important of the three? You said return on reporting and see what sticks. What did you mean by that?
So what did I mean? Yeah, this is something that actually came from, a couple of different people. And I was really shocked because I thought, hey, isn't that risky or like whatever? But they were like, we weren't finding that, we were getting enough value out of the product. And he goes, one of the engineers was like, hey, why haven't we turned on all these features? And they were like, hey, we don't need them, or it's just like, out of scope or whatever. And the engineer was like, well, why don't we just turn them on and see what happens or what value? It's not like they were making any changes to any environment or anything. It was just like kind of like reporting features or what have you. And they actually found like a ton of use cases that came out of that, which were like, hey, we didn't know the product could actually do this. And that encouraged them to sort of like ask the vendor a few more questions and, say, hey, you've got this feature. And they're like, yeah, that's been there. Didn't you read the manual? And like, who reads the manual? So they went on and they enabled features that maybe weren't completely in line with the original specs, but sometimes it's what you make of it. So just trying to turn on features or pushing the product further, and what's the worst that could happen really is kind of like the underlying theme there.
Well, I think it's a really practical suggestion. I think sometimes there's a hurrying up to throw the vendor out, but the vendor has a vested interest in keeping the product on site. And one of your suggestions is re-engage the vendor, like ask them to come on site. But you've made a point, not with the sales rep, but the technical support folks. And why would you say it's better to have the technical support than the sales reps?
Yeah, because, sales rep, the problem is that, a lot of the time they're very good at explaining the product and getting the sale. And a lot of them have that technical knowledge, but they're not really traditionally practitioners. And they probably can't help you to solve something that's just a problem for you. Whereas if you get one of the technical folk online or one of their engineers or what have you, you can say, hey, this is what I'm using the product for. Is this what you designed it for? Is this really, what it is? And they can actually help you work through, okay, what have you tried doing this? Maybe we can try creating these new functions or rules, or, did you know there's an advanced editor here that I can sort out for you? And this is an investment on part of the vendor, because they have to give a more sort of like skilled or expensive resource to help a customer out. But the returns on that can be huge, because, that's really the way. With half a day or a few hours of that, customer normally can find out whether this is the product that they want to stay with or not.
I think that's a great suggestion. And so from the customer side, I think it's just smart because, like you said, the CISO's moved on and someone has to come in and do something with this expensive system. And I think it's a great approach. So you are onto AlienVault now. You're at 451. Where else can people find out about you and learn about your expertise, learn about what are some good ways people can reach out and talk to you further?
That's a dangerous question, because that question after a few days, it's normally like, how do I get away from you? So the best way to just have initial contact is generally Twitter's normally a good place. I'm all over the Twitters normally, particularly if I'm meant to be doing some work. You probably find me procrastinating on Twitter. Other than that, I have my website, j4bv4d.com is the website. That's my Twitter ID as well. And I also have a YouTube channel. Yay. I feel so cool when I say that in front of my kids. It's InfoSec Cynic is the YouTube channel. But all the links are there on my website. So I take emails as well.
Yeah, I think that your website is very, very interesting. I love the way that you're using YouTube to educate about your expertise. And I also have a book that you've written. Is that the one that I think I've seen on your site? Can you get that on Amazon?
it started off just as a, I don't know how it started. Someone asked me, some tips on the CISSP, the certification. And they were like, hey, I've got this really big book and it's really difficult to read. So I was like, okay, I'll give you some tips. And those tips sort of like formed the basis of like the book, really. It's called the CISSP Companion Guide. And it's not meant to be a replacement of the official guide, which actually the IC Squared asked me to be the technical editor for in this latest edition off the back of that. But it's really taking all of the domains and the theory, but then overlaying it with personal experiences and anecdotes and stories. So, it's like the passwords in the envelope story, that kind of thing are all in there. So when you get to this whole bit about privilege management or identity access management, I just lean on a lot of the examples and experiences I experienced, growing up through the industry.
So that's the CISSP Companion Guide, right?
That's right. Yes.
I see that. I see it on your website as well. So I'll definitely provide show notes to that. And why did you leave 451 to AlienVault? What is it about AlienVault that you were compelled to move to?
So I've worked in the enterprise side, and I've worked now on the analyst side. And so the vendor side was the natural sort of like gaping hole in my resume. It's like, you hear a lot about these vendors and how they operate and what have you. So I really was keen to get that experience. And then it was like down to, well, which one do I go to? Because there are some great companies out there. But I chose AlienVault, I suppose, because it's one of those kind of like still startup-y type companies where everything happens really fast and there's not tons and tons of bureaucracy, because that's one thing I think I've had enough of in previous lives. And then the technology I've always found really interesting. But also like the ethos of the company is really open. They have like open source software that they give away. So they have an open source like, threat intelligence and SIM offering as well. So it's kind of like a very community-driven company that not only obviously is a commercial company, it's there to make money, but it's actually tries to help out the community and be an active participant in that, which is something that I really value myself, and having the opportunity to do that as well as work in a company, I found to be too good an opportunity to overlook.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, I appreciate you spending time with us, educating about your knowledge and your expertise, and I will definitely link all of this information up on the show notes so that those of our listeners who want to go either take a look at your books or listen to your YouTube channel or find what you're doing in AlienVault or 451, that they can do that. So I appreciate you for your time today.
No, thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate you having me.
So that wraps up another show of the Red Zone podcast. And I want to thank you for listening. And I hope the interview with Javvad Malik was a beneficial one for you. I also want to thank our sponsors, Red Zone Technologies. You can find Red Zone Technologies at redzonetech.net. If you're looking for IT security assessments, IT security planning tools like the scoreboard, the CIO scoreboard is quite an amazing tool. It's both CIOs are using this for their staff, and they're using the data gathered to be able to be presented to the board and the CEO using visualization tools. So if you're interested in extracting the complexity from your IT security enterprise and being able to present a portfolio and an investment-based approach to your enterprise, take a look at redzonetech.net CIO scoreboard. You can just see just by go to the drop down and see CIO scoreboard. Also, if you enjoyed the show, go to iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, whatever your flavor, and leave a review. Just leave a quick note of how you enjoyed the program. This goes a long way in helping our show popularity and helping other IT leaders and IT security professionals for finding the show. So until next time, thank you very much.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show.
This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.